In the quiet coastal village of Seacliff, life moved at a gentle pace. The villagers, content in their routines, rarely ventured far from the comfort of their homes. But on the outskirts of the village, in a small cottage overlooking the sea, lived a man who found solace in solitude. Jonas, the reclusive fisherman, had called Seacliff home for as long as anyone could remember. His weathered face and calloused hands spoke of a life spent battling the elements, yet his eyes held a softness that hinted at a deeper story. Every morning, as the sun began its ascent over the horizon, Jonas would make his way down to the shore, his fishing rod in hand. The villagers, accustomed to his quiet presence, paid him little mind. They knew little of the man who lived among them, and Jonas preferred it that way. But there was one who knew Jonas better than anyone else in the village. She was a creature of the wild, a bear who roamed the woods near Jonas' cottage. The villagers spoke of her in hushed tones, their fear palpable. They saw her as a threat, a menace to be avoided at all costs. Jonas, however, saw her differently. To him, she was a kindred spirit, a being who, like him, found solace in the solitude of nature. He had first encountered her years ago, when she was just a cub. He had watched her grow, marveling at her strength and grace. Every day, as he made his way back from the shore, Jonas would leave scraps of food near the forest's edge. It was a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. He knew the bear was lonely, just as he was, and in his own quiet way, he sought to ease her solitude. As the years passed, Jonas and the bear developed an unspoken bond. She would watch him from the shadows of the forest, her eyes filled with a curiosity that belied her fearsome reputation. And Jonas, in turn, would speak to her softly, his words carried on the gentle breeze. But their peaceful coexistence was about to be shattered. For in the village, a new threat was emerging. A notorious hunter, known for his cruelty and greed, had set his sights on the bear, and he would stop at nothing to claim his prize. The hunter's name was Orion, and he was a man who reveled in his own legend. He had come to Seacliff with a singular purpose, to hunt down the bear that had eluded him for so long. Orion was a born storyteller, and he wasted no time in regaling the villagers with tales of his exploits. He spoke of the countless animals he had felled, his voice dripping with a twisted sort of pride. The villagers, enamored by his bravado, hung on his every word. But there was one who saw through Orion's facade. Sarah, the village's wise woman, had lived in Seacliff longer than anyone could remember. She had seen the best and worst of human nature, and she knew a dangerous man when she saw one. Sarah watched as Orion strutted through the village, his chest puffed out like a preening rooster. She saw the way the villagers fawned over him, their eyes wide with admiration, and she knew that trouble was brewing. One evening, as the sun began to set over the sea, Sarah made her way to Jonas' cottage. She found him sitting on his porch, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. "Jonas," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk." Jonas turned to face her, his eyes filled with a quiet curiosity. He had always respected Sarah, for he knew that she possessed a wisdom that few could match. "What is it, Sarah?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. Sarah took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to say. "There's a hunter in the village," she began, her words measured and careful. "He's come for the bear." Jonas felt a chill run down his spine. He had always known that this day would come, that someone would eventually seek to harm his gentle friend. But he had never imagined that it would be someone like Orion. "What can we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah shook her head, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. "I'm afraid there's not much we can do," she said. "Orion is a powerful man, and he has the village under his spell." Jonas nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He knew that Sarah was right, that Orion was a force to be reckoned with. But he also knew that he could not sit idly by while the bear was in danger. "I have to warn her," he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "I have to keep her safe." Sarah placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with understanding. "Be careful, Jonas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Orion is a dangerous man. He will stop at nothing to get what he wants." Jonas nodded, his mind already racing with thoughts of what he must do. He knew that he was about to embark on a perilous journey, one that would test the limits of his courage and resolve. But he also knew that he had no choice. The bear was his friend, his companion in the solitude of the wild, and he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. As the sun began to rise over the village of Seacliff, Jonas set out into the woods. He moved with a quiet determination, his footsteps barely making a sound on the soft forest floor. He knew the woods like the back of his hand, having spent countless hours exploring their hidden depths. But today the forest felt different. The air was thick with tension, and the usually chirping birds were eerily silent. Jonas pressed on, his senses on high alert. He knew that Orion was out there somewhere, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his chance to strike, and he would not let that happen. As he made his way deeper into the woods, Jonas began to hear a familiar sound. It was the sound of heavy footsteps, of something large moving through the undergrowth, and he knew that it could only be one thing. Orion shook off his grip, his face contorted with rage. "Get out of my way," he spat, his words dripping with venom. "I'm not going to let you stop me from claiming my prize." But Jonas held his ground, his eyes locked on Orion's face. "Listen to me," he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "The bear is not your enemy. She's just scared and confused." Orion let out a harsh laugh, his face twisted into a cruel sneer. "Scared and confused?" he scoffed, his words dripping with contempt. "That beast is a killer, and I'm going to put it down." But before he could take another step, a figure emerged from the trees. It was the bear, her coat matted with blood and her eyes wild with fear. Jonas felt his heart sink, his mind racing with thoughts of what could have happened. But before he could say a word, the bear let out another roar, her voice filled with pain and desperation. And then, to Jonas' horror, she charged. Time seemed to slow down as the bear barreled towards them, her eyes wild with fear and pain. Jonas felt his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing with thoughts of what he must do. He knew that he couldn't let the bear hurt Orion, no matter how much he despised the hunter. But he also knew that he couldn't let Orion harm the bear, who was clearly in distress. In a split second, Jonas made his decision. He lunged forward, placing himself between Orion and the charging bear. He could hear Orion's startled cry behind him, but he paid it no mind. His focus was solely on the bear, who was rapidly closing the distance between them. As the bear approached, Jonas held out his hands, his voice low and soothing. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his words barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. "It's okay. I'm here." To his surprise, the bear skidded to a halt, her eyes wide with confusion. She let out a low whine, her head cocked to the side as if trying to understand what was happening. Jonas took a tentative step forward, his hands still outstretched. "That's it," he said softly, his voice filled with a quiet reassurance. "You're safe now." Behind him, Orion let out a snarl of rage. "What are you doing?" he spat, his words dripping with venom. "That beast is dangerous." But Jonas ignored him, his focus solely on the bear. He could see the pain in her eyes, the fear that had driven her to attack, and he knew that he had to help her no matter what the cost. Slowly, carefully, he approached the bear, his hands still outstretched in a gesture of peace. The bear watched him warily, her body tense and ready to strike at any moment. But as Jonas drew closer, he saw something that made his heart skip a beat. There, on the bear's back leg, was a deep gash, oozing blood onto the forest floor. Jonas felt a surge of anger rise up within him, his mind racing with thoughts of who could have done such a thing. But he pushed those thoughts aside, his focus solely on the bear and her well. Jonas moved closer to the bear, his eyes locked on the deep gash on her hind leg. The wound looked serious, and he knew that he had to act fast if he wanted to help her. Behind him, Orion was growing increasingly agitated. "Are you insane?" he hissed, his voice filled with a mix of fear and anger. That beast is going to tear you apart." But Jonas paid him no mind. He knew that the bear was in pain, and he was determined to do whatever it took to help her. As he approached, the bear let out a low growl, her eyes wary and distrustful. But Jonas kept his movements slow and deliberate, his voice low and soothing. "It's okay," he murmured, his words barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. "I'm not going to hurt you. I just want to help." To his surprise, the bear seemed to understand. She let out a soft whine, her body relaxing slightly as Jonas drew closer. With trembling hands, Jonas reached out and gently touched the bear's wound. The bear flinched, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she watched him with a curious expression, as if trying to understand what he was doing. Jonas took a deep breath, his mind racing with thoughts of what he must do. He knew that he couldn't leave the bear like this, not with such a serious injury. But he also knew that he couldn't do it alone. He turned to Orion, his eyes pleading. "I need your help," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have to get her back to the village, so we can treat her wound." Orion's face twisted with disgust, his lip curling in a sneer. "You want me to help you save that beast?" he spat, his words dripping with contempt. "After all the trouble it's caused?" But Jonas held his ground, his eyes locked on Orion's face. "Please," he said, his voice filled with a quiet desperation. "She's in pain, and she needs our help. We can't just leave her like this." For a long moment, Orion was silent, his eyes narrowed in suspicion. But then, to Jonas' surprise, he let out a heavy sigh. "Fine," he grumbled, his voice filled with reluctance. "But if that bear so much as looks at me funny, I won't hesitate to put a bullet in its head." Jonas nodded, his heart pounding with relief. He knew that he was taking a huge risk, trusting Orion to help him. But he also knew that he had no choice. Together, the two men worked to fashion a makeshift stretcher out of branches and vines. It was crude, but it would have to do. With great care, they lifted the bear onto the stretcher, her body heavy and unwieldy. The bear let out a soft whimper, her eyes filled with pain and confusion. But Jonas stayed by her side, his voice low and soothing. "It's okay," he murmured, his words barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. "We're going to get you help. Just hold on a little longer." And so, with Orion's reluctant assistance, Jonas began the long trek back to the village, the bear's fate hanging in the balance. As they made their way through the dense underbrush of the forest, Jonas could feel the bear's labored breathing beneath his hands. She was in pain, and he knew that time was running out. Orion, for his part, seemed to be having second thoughts about the whole endeavor. He kept casting wary glances at the bear, his hand never straying far from his rifle. "This is madness," he muttered, his voice filled with a mix of fear and anger. "We should have left that beast to die in the woods." But Jonas ignored him, his focus solely on the bear. He knew that he had to get her back to the village, no matter what the cost. As they approached the outskirts of Seacliff, Jonas could hear the murmur of voices in the distance. The villagers had gathered in the square, their faces etched with worry and confusion. Jonas felt a surge of fear rise up within him, his mind racing with thoughts of what they would say when they saw the bear. He knew that many of them feared her, just as Orion did. And he couldn't blame them, not after all the stories they had heard. But he also knew that he had to try. He had to make them see the bear for what she truly was, a gentle creature in need of their help. The bear emerged from the trees, her coat glistening in the dappled sunlight. She seemed to sense Jonas' presence, for she turned to face him, her eyes filled with a quiet curiosity. Jonas approached her slowly, his hands held out in a gesture of peace. He had no fear of the bear, for he knew that she would never harm him. She was his friend, his companion in the solitude of the wild. "Hey there, girl," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've got some bad news." The bear cocked her head to the side, as if she understood his words. And perhaps she did, for there was a depth of understanding in her eyes that belied her fearsome reputation. Jonas took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he was about to say. "There's a hunter in the village," he began, his words measured and careful. He's come for you." The bear let out a low growl, her hackles rising in a display of primal fear. She knew the danger that humans posed, for she had seen the destruction they had wrought upon her kind. Jonas reached out to her, his hand gentle on her fur. "I won't let him hurt you," he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "I promise." The bear leaned into his touch, her eyes closing in a moment of pure trust. And in that moment, Jonas knew that he would do whatever it took to keep her safe. But their peaceful moment was shattered by the sound of a gunshot, echoing through the trees like a clap of thunder. Jonas felt his heart skip a beat, his body tensing with a sudden surge of adrenaline. He turned to the bear, his eyes wide with fear. "Run," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. "Run as fast as you can." The bear hesitated for a moment, her eyes locked on Jonas' face. But then she turned and bounded off into the trees, her powerful legs carrying her away from the danger that lurked in the shadows. Jonas watched her go, his heart heavy with the knowledge of what he must do. He knew that he could not run, that he must face the hunter head-on. And he would do so with the courage and resolve that had carried him through a lifetime of solitude. Jonas made his way back to the village, his mind racing with thoughts of what he must do. He knew that Orion would not rest until he had claimed his prize, and he would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. As he approached the outskirts of the village, Jonas heard a commotion. The villagers were gathered in the square, their voices raised in a cacophony of excitement and fear. Jonas pushed his way through the crowd, his heart pounding in his chest. And there, in the center of the square, stood Orion. He was holding a rifle, his face twisted into a cruel smile. "Listen up, everyone," he said, his voice booming across the square. "I'm going to catch that bear, and I'm going to skin it alive. And anyone who gets in my way will suffer the consequences." The villagers shrank back in fear, their eyes wide with terror. They had never seen Orion like this before, so consumed by his own twisted desires. But Jonas stepped forward, his chin held high. "You won't touch her," he said, his voice steady and calm. "I won't let you." Orion turned to face him, his eyes narrowing in a dangerous glare. "And who are you to stop me?" he sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. Jonas met his gaze, his eyes filled with a quiet resolve. "I'm the one who's been protecting her all these years," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I'll continue to do so, no matter what." Orion let out a harsh laugh, his face twisted into a cruel sneer. "You're a fool," he spat, his words dripping with venom. "You think you can stand against me? I'll crush you like a bug." But Jonas did not back down. He stood his ground, his eyes locked on Orion's face. "You may be a skilled hunter," he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination, "but you know nothing of the true nature of the wild. You see only what you want to see, and you destroy everything in your path." Orion's face twisted with rage, his fingers tightening on the trigger of his rifle. But before he could make a move, Sarah stepped forward, her eyes filled with a quiet wisdom. "Listen to him, Orion," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Jonas knows the bear better than anyone. He's seen her true nature, and he knows that she means no harm." Orion scoffed, his lip curling in a sneer. "You're just as foolish as he is," he spat, his words dripping with contempt. "That bear is a menace, and I won't rest until I've put it down." But Sarah shook her head, her eyes filled with a deep sadness. "You're wrong, Orion," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "The only menace here is you." Orion's face twisted with rage, his finger tightening on the trigger of his rifle. But before he could make a move, Jonas stepped forward, his hand outstretched in a gesture of peace. "Let me show you," he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. "Let me show you the true nature of the bear. And if you still want to hunt her after that, then I won't stand in your way." Orion hesitated for a moment, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. But then he lowered his rifle, his face twisted into a scowl. "Fine," he spat, his words dripping with contempt. "But if you're playing me for a fool, I'll make you regret it." Jonas nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that he was taking a huge risk, but he also knew that it was the only way to keep the bear safe. And so, with Orion at his side, Jonas set out into the woods once more. He could only hope that he could show the hunter the truth before it was too late. As Jonas and Orion made their way through the dense underbrush of the forest, a tense silence hung between them. Jonas could feel the hunter's eyes boring into his back, and he knew that Orion was just waiting for an opportunity to strike. But Jonas pushed on, his senses on high alert. He knew the woods like the back of his hand, and he was determined to use that knowledge to his advantage. As they approached a small clearing, Jonas held up a hand, signaling for Orion to stop. The hunter complied, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "What is it?" he hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. Jonas shook his head, his eyes scanning the trees. "Something's not right," he said, his voice filled with a quiet unease. "The birds have gone silent." Orion scoffed, his lip curling in a sneer. "So what?" he spat, his words dripping with contempt. "Birds go silent all the time." But Jonas knew better. He had spent his entire life in these woods, and he knew that when the birds went silent, it could only mean one thing. Danger was near. Suddenly, a loud roar echoed through the trees, causing both men to freeze in their tracks. Jonas felt his heart skip a beat, his body tensing with a sudden surge of adrenaline. He knew that roar. He had heard it countless times before, in the quiet solitude of the woods. And he knew that it could only belong to one creature, the bear. Orion's face twisted into a cruel smile, his fingers tightening on the trigger of his rifle. Finally, he hissed, his voice filled with a twisted sort of glee. "The hunt begins." But before he could take a step forward, Jonas grabbed his arm, his eyes wide with fear. "Wait," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Something's wrong." As the weeks passed, the bear continued to heal under Sarah and Jonas' care. Her wound had closed completely, leaving only a faint scar as a reminder of her ordeal. Jonas spent every moment he could with her, marveling at the strength and resilience she showed in the face of such adversity. He knew that she had been through more than any creature should have to endure, but he also knew that she had not let it break her spirit. And as he watched her grow stronger with each passing day, Jonas began to feel a strange sense of unease. He knew that the time was coming when the bear would have to leave the safety of Sarah's cottage and return to the woods. And he wasn't sure if he was ready to let her go. One evening, as he sat by the bear's side, stroking her soft fur, Sarah approached him with a gentle smile. "Jonas," she said, her voice filled with a quiet understanding, "I know how much you care for her, but you must know that she cannot stay here forever." Jonas nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He knew that Sarah was right, that the bear belonged in the wild, not cooped up in a tiny cottage. But the thought of letting her go filled him with a sense of dread. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but I don't know if I can do it, Sarah. I don't know if I can say goodbye." Sarah placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with compassion. "I understand," she said softly, "but you must remember that this is not goodbye, Jonas. The bear will always be a part of you, no matter where she goes." Jonas felt a lump form in his throat, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. He knew that Sarah was right, that the bear would always hold a special place in his heart. But the thought of letting her go still filled him with a sense of loss. And so, with a heavy heart, Jonas began to prepare for the bear's departure. He gathered supplies for her journey, packing them carefully into a small sack. And as he worked, he tried to imagine the bear roaming free once more, her spirit unbroken by the cruelty of the world. But even as he prepared for her departure, Jonas could not shake the sense of unease that had settled over him. He knew that Orion was still out there, his heart filled with a twisted desire for revenge. And he feared what the hunter might do if he discovered that the bear was no longer under the protection of the village. As the day of the bear's departure drew near, Jonas found himself spending more and more time in the woods, searching for signs of Orion's presence. He knew that he had to be vigilant, that he had to protect the bear at all costs. And then, On the eve of her departure, Jonas made a startling discovery. As he walked through the woods, he stumbled upon a small clearing, his heart racing with fear and excitement. There, lying in the center of the clearing, was an ancient artifact, its surface inscribed with strange symbols and markings. Jonas knew that he had never seen anything like it before, and he felt a shiver run down his spine. With trembling hands, he picked up the artifact, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew that he had to show it to Sarah, that she would know what to make of it. And so, with the artifact clutched tightly in his hand, Jonas made his way back to the village, his heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and excitement. He knew that the artifact held the key to unlocking the bear's true purpose, and he was determined to discover what that purpose might be. As Jonas entered Sarah's cottage, the bear lifted her head, her eyes filled with a quiet curiosity. She seemed to sense that something was different, that Jonas carried with him a strange energy that she had never felt before. Sarah too seemed to sense the change in Jonas' demeanor. She looked up from her work, her eyes widening as she caught sight of the artifact in his hand. "Jonas," she said, her voice filled with a mix of awe and disbelief. "Where did you find that?" Jonas shook his head, his heart pounding with excitement. "I found it in the woods," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what it is, but I know that it's important." Sarah took the artifact from him, her fingers tracing the strange symbols and markings that adorned its surface. For a long moment, she was silent, her brow furrowed in concentration. And then, suddenly, her eyes widened with understanding. "Jonas," she said, her voice filled with a quiet reverence. "Do you know what this is?" Jonas shook his head, his heart racing with anticipation. "No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I know that it has something to do with the bear." Sarah nodded, her eyes filled with a strange mix of wonder and fear. "This artifact is ancient," she said, her voice filled with a quiet awe. "It is said to hold the power to unlock the secrets of the natural world, to reveal the true purpose of all living things." Jonas felt a shiver run down his spine, his mind racing with possibilities. He knew that the artifact held the key to understanding the bear's true nature, and he was determined to unlock its secrets. But even as he contemplated the artifact's power, Jonas could not shake the sense of unease that had settled over him. He knew that Orion was still out there, his heart filled with a twisted desire for revenge, and he feared what the hunter might do if he discovered the artifact's existence. As if sensing his thoughts, Sarah placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her eyes filled with understanding. "Jonas," she said, her voice soft but firm, "you must be careful. The power of this artifact is not to be taken lightly. In the wrong hands, it could bring great harm to our village, and to the bear." Jonas nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. He knew that Sarah was right, that he had to be vigilant in his protection of the artifact, and of the bear. And so, with a heavy heart, Jonas made his way back to the woods, the artifact clutched tightly in his hand. He knew that he had to find a way to keep it safe, to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands. As he walked, his mind raced with possibilities, trying to devise a plan to protect both the bear and the ancient relic. Suddenly, a rustling in the undergrowth caught his attention. Jonas froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that it could be Orion, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But as he peered into the foliage, he saw a familiar shape emerge. It was the bear, her eyes filled with a strange mix of curiosity and understanding. Jonas felt a wave of relief wash over him, his grip on the artifact loosening slightly. The bear approached him, her movements slow and deliberate. She seemed to sense the importance of the moment, the weight of the responsibility that Jonas carried. As she drew closer, Jonas held out the artifact, his hand trembling slightly. The bear sniffed at it, her eyes widening with recognition. And then, to Jonas' amazement, she gently took the artifact from his hand, holding it delicately in her mouth. Jonas watched in awe as the bear turned and began to walk deeper into the woods, the artifact gleaming in the dappled sunlight. He knew that he had to trust her, to believe in the connection that they shared. And so, with a final glance over his shoulder, Jonas turned and made his way back to the village, his heart filled with a strange mix of hope and uncertainty. He knew that the future held many challenges, but he also knew that he had the strength and the courage to face them, no matter what the cost. As he walked, he could feel the eyes of the forest upon him, the whispers of the wind carrying the promise of a brighter tomorrow. And he knew that, whatever the future might bring, he would always have the bear by his side, a symbol of the unbreakable bond between man and nature. The end.